A market crash is one of the most terrifying things you can watch. Trillions of dollars evaporate in days. Retirement accounts get cut in half. The news fills with words like collapse, recession, ruin. And yet every single time it happens, a small group of people quietly walk away far richer than they were before. Not because they got lucky, not because they guessed right. They get richer because of the crash. The very event that destroys everyone else is the event that builds them. So how is that possible? How can the same crash that wipes out one person make another person a fortune? The answer is one of the most important and least comfortable truths in all of finance, because once you understand where the money in a crash actually goes, you'll never see a market panic or your own place in it the same way again. Let's start with the question everyone gets wrong. When a market crashes and say $10 trillion disappears, where does it go? Your instinct says it's destroyed, vaporized, gone up in smoke. That's certainly what it feels like when you watch your account bleed out. But here's the first surprise, and everything depends on it. That money isn't destroyed. Most of it is transferred. It doesn't vanish, it changes hands. Think about what actually happens in a crash. Prices fall because people are selling in a panic, dumping their shares, their assets, anything they can, desperate to get to safety. But for every one of those terrified sellers, someone on the other side is quietly buying. And they're buying at a massive discount from people who are too scared to hold on. A crash stripped of all its drama is the largest sale the world ever holds. Everything goes on clearance at once. Great companies, quality assets, all marked down 50, 60, 70%, not because they become worthless, but because everyone is too frightened to want them. And whoever has the cash and the calm to buy during that sale ends up owning those assets when the fear passes and the prices come roaring back. The crash didn't destroy the wealth. It moved it from the people who panicked and sold into the hands of the people who stayed calm and bought. So who are these people? Who actually manages to be a buyer while the world is on fire? The most famous of them will tell you exactly how it's done in 8 words. You've probably heard them. Be fearful when others are greedy, and greedy when others are fearful. That's Warren Buffett, and it's easy to hear that line as a cute slogan until you see what he did with it. In 2008, at the absolute peak of the financial crisis, banks collapsing, the entire system dazed from the edge, seasoned investors fleeing for cash, Buffett did something that looked insane. He wrote a public letter to America titled, "Buy American, I Am." And while everyone else was running for the exits, he poured billions into the fire. $5 billion into Goldman Sachs, more into General Electric, buying up strong companies at the exact moment everyone else was too terrified to touch them. He even had a name for that moment. He called it an economic Pearl Harbor. And he bought anyway, because he understood the secret we just uncovered. He wasn't catching a falling knife. He was standing at the biggest clearance sale of his lifetime, filling his cart. So the lesson is simple, right? Be brave. Buy when everyone else is scared. Get rich from the crash. Not so fast. Because here's your second surprise. And it's where most people completely misread what's really happening. You might assume this takes genius, that these buyers are brilliant enough to spot the exact bottom, to time the crash perfectly. But that's not it at all. Buffett himself says flatly that he has no idea when the market will turn. His own words, "Don't wait for the robins or you'll miss spring." He wasn't timing anything. He wasn't smarter about the future than the people selling to him. He simply had 2 things they didn't. In the moment it mattered most, cash and calm. And that quiet detail cracks open the real story of who gets rich in a crash. And it's a story most videos are far too comfortable to tell you. Because now we have to ask the uncomfortable question. If getting richer from a crash just requires having spare cash lying around and the security to stay calm while your neighbors panic, then who exactly has those things when everything is falling apart? The answer is overwhelmingly the people who were already wealthy. And this is the part you rarely hear. A crash isn't just a sale, it's a transfer, and it tends to move wealth in one direction, upward. Look at what actually happened after the crash of 2020. The market cratered, and then it came roaring back, and that rebound made the already rich dramatically richer, even as tens of millions of ordinary people lost their jobs. According to Oxfam, the world's top 1,000 billionaires recovered everything they'd lost in the crash in just 9 months. The world's poorest people, their recovery could take more than a decade. After the 2008 crash, it took billionaires about 5 years to recover. After 2020, it took 9 months. In fact, in the months after that crash, the combined wealth of the world's billionaires didn't just recover, it rose by nearly $4 trillion. Buffett's own fortune crossed $100 billion in early 2021 during the very same stretch that more than 8 million Americans fell below the poverty line. So why does the crash move wealth upward so reliably? Because of the cruelest part of the mechanism. The people forced to sell at the very bottom, locking in their losses, handing over their assets at fire sale prices, usually aren't selling because they lost their nerve. They're selling because they lost their job, because they have no emergency fund, no buffer, no choice. The crash arrives at the exact moment they most need cash and forces them to hand their assets to the people who have plenty of it. That's the engine underneath. Crashes make some people rich. A crash transfers assets from the people who are desperate to the people who are liquid. And more often than not, the liquid were already rich to begin with, which might make you think the answer is obvious. Just be the buyer. Be greedy when others are fearful. But before you take that as gospel, there's one more surprise waiting. Because even for the people who can buy, this is nowhere near the guaranteed jackpot it sounds like. We tell ourselves a comforting story. The market always recovers, and in America, historically, it has. But that is a dangerous half-truth. Ask Japan. At the end of 1989, the Japanese stock market hit an all-time high, and then it crashed, and it did not recover for 34 years. Not 34 weeks, 34 years. An entire generation of people who bought the dip in Japan waited most of their working lives just to get back to even. And that's the index, the whole market. Individual companies are far more brutal. In the 2008 crash, plenty of people bravely bought the dip on companies that never came back. Lehman Brothers went to zero. General Electric, one of the most storied companies in America, saw its stock fall under $7 and stay broken for years. Buying during a crash didn't make those people rich. It wiped them out. Buffett himself warned about exactly this, that in a panic, you have to avoid the fragile, over-leveraged dying companies because a crash doesn't discount those. It buries them. So being greedy when others are fearful is not a magic button. Buy the wrong thing, or need your money before the recovery comes and the crash takes you too. Which finally brings us to the real question, the one that actually matters for you. Because you're probably not a billionaire with a war chest waiting to swoop in. You might even be one of the people a crash puts in danger. So what is the actual usable lesson hiding inside all of this? Here it is, and it's the quiet inversion of everything the Buffett stories seem to teach. You do not have to be greedy when others are fearful. That's the advanced move, and it mostly belongs to people who already have capital. But there is a beginner's version of that exact same rule, one available to almost anyone and nearly as powerful. You just have to not be fearful when others are fearful. Sit with the difference because it changes everything. You don't have to heroically time the bottom. You don't need a pile of spare cash. You simply have to refuse to sell in the panic. And if you possibly can, let your boring, automatic investing keep quietly buying right through the crash, the way we've talked about before. Because remember what a crash actually is, a transfer from the people who sell to the people who hold, and holding costs nothing. Staying still is free. You may never be the person filling their cart at the bottom, but you can almost always avoid being the person forced or scared into emptying theirs, and simply staying on the right side of that transfer, again and again, across every crash of your investing life is enough to quietly put you among the people a crash builds instead of the people it breaks. Now, I have to be honest, because this is where it gets real. For some people, just don't sell is genuinely not a choice. If a crash costs you your job and your rent is due, you sell what you have to sell, and no amount of willpower changes that. That isn't a failure of nerve. It's a lack of options, and it's the exact vulnerability that lets the transfer happen in the first place, which is why everything we've ever said about the boring foundation, the emergency fund, the buffer, living below your means was never really boring at all. That buffer is the thing that buys you the one luxury that matters most in a crash, the ability to not sell, the freedom to hold, the choice to sit still while everyone else is forced to move. So here's the truth about market crashes, and it's bigger than money. A crash was never really destroying wealth. It was moving it from the people who flinch to the people who don't, from the forced to the free. And which side of that transfer you land on has surprisingly little to do with how much you started with, and almost everything to do with whether you built the stability and the nerve to stand still when the whole world is running for the door. The crash isn't the disaster. The crash is the test. And now you know what it's actually testing. Next time on this channel, we're going to look at the strange psychology of why we feel the pain of losing money about twice as intensely as the joy of making it, and how that single hidden wiring quietly drives almost every money mistake you'll ever make.